Awesome. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see the screen. If at any point you can't, let me know. And I'm also going to just start off by saying I have 4 cats and a bird. So if any chaos occurs, it'll just make it more fun. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us for this learning group today. My name is Aszya Summers. I've been with the Empathy Network since it became a network. And I currently work at Lincoln Park Zoo in the development department. But the presentation I'm going to show today actually originated as a training that I used to do for my staff when I oversaw education and animal care at Racine Zoo. So parts of it, we're going to talk about the training, and then I kind of tweaked it a little bit for obviously you guys, since this is a zoo audience, a little more advanced than an intern group coming in, which is the typical audience I originally did this for. So this is, we're on the same side, how to talk to those who are anti-zoo. So what is zoo negativity or anti-zoo? I kind of wanted to start there. When I'm talking about this today, I'm talking about a really wide range of different things that can be zoo negativity. So this could be everything from I hate zoos, zoos are horrible, let all the animals run free in the jungles of Illinois, I don't know. Or it could be this animal's sad, I hate what you do, that kind of negativity. Anyone who's just kind of generally against zoos. And there's obviously a wide variety of different views and opinions that kind of fall under this bigger umbrella. But the question I really want to think about is, why do people feel this way? And I know everyone's still popping introductions in the chat, but if anyone feels comfortable or wants to either unmute or pop in the chat why you think people might feel anti-zoo or negative about zoos. What are some reasons? And I know some of you guys have been through my training, so you guys should be experts. Saw a couple names that have done this before. Zoos history, that's a big one. Zoos started off as menageries. They weren't always for conservation. They used to be for entertainment. That can be a huge one. Misinformation. I'm seeing different things like believing animals are taken from the wild. They feel bad because animals are locked up. Yeah, a lot of, how they look, some of the empathy related things for sure. Misplaced empathy. Small enclosures, think they sometimes they see one enclosure and they don't realize that that's not the only place that animal spends their whole time. So there's a lot of different categories here, but a lot of it is empathy, a lot of it is misinformation, right? So when I think, why do people feel this way? I go even a little bit deeper than that. I think anyone who's anti-zoo feels that way at its core for all of these different reasons, because they care about the animals, right? If you are putting energy forth to be against zoos, it is probably because you're an animal lover, which is why I have the used to be more controversial, less so as time goes on, opinion that they're on the same side as us. Empathy goes for people too. They might be dealing with a different set of information, and that's probably why they are coming in with that negative zoo feeling. But they are on the same team. They care about animals. If we can get the same information to everybody and they actually listen and understand what we're doing, they're probably going to be pro-zoo, right? I'm talking to a room full of zoo people. Obviously, there's a lot of bias here, but they are pro-zoo, or they could be pro-zoo. So when you're having these conversations, the most important thing, and the thing I want to emphasize first, is being positive. And remember that both you and them want what's best for the animals. We are not on opposite sides, right? So I think that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind, especially you guys, your zoo experts, your empathy experts. As difficult as it can be, as this dog is showing, try to keep that positivity when you go into these situations. So there's a lot of things you can do when you're going into any kind of polarizing, emotional, political issue. So this framework really works for any of these types of things. The number one thing to do is listen. When people have opposing viewpoints and people are very entrenched in their beliefs, one of the things that a lot of social research institutes have found, Frameworks Institute is the one I'm thinking of right now, they don't listen to the other person. And even just in an argument with a friend or a significant other, you've probably experienced this, where everyone just is trying so hard to get their own perspective across. They don't understand the other side's perspective. And again, if the core issue here is different information that we're going in with, different thought processes, listening and understanding their perspective is huge. Show them you understand what they're saying. I've found this to be really helpful when you have someone who is not good at this and everything you say, they have no, no, no. You cannot flip that conversation positive if they're just going no, 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 right? I'm sure a lot of you guys have experienced this. Repeat what they said back to them. The tiger looks bored. Oh, you think our tiger looks bored? I'm sorry to hear that, right? Can they say no to that? No, they have to say, oh, now we're on the same page. They're hearing me, they're understanding me. And that's a really great way to kind of diffuse a situation and begin to be able to redirect something like that. Remember, you don't know someone else's experiences, background knowledge. So some of you guys are popping into the chat over here with things like the history of zoos or backgrounds. Not all zoos are the same. First off, conservation as a concept didn't even really come to the public forefront until the 70s. That's not that long ago. That is 50 years ago. So any guest who is above 50 remembers a time when conservation wasn't even a thought, when the idea that human actions could impact wild animal populations was not widely accepted. So zoos were certainly not about that. We all know that zoos were about some place to go for entertainment. Before that, they were even a place to show how rich you were. Look, I have enough meat for my family and the tiger chained up in the backyard, right? And that might be all they know about zoos. They might know somebody that worked at a zoo that is less respectable, right? They might have gone to a zoo that is less credible. They might have a friend who worked at one. They might only have a memory. This is from a professor I had in college. Her only memory was going to zoos as a kid where her and her grandma would throw popcorn at the animals. And that might be all they know. So you don't know where they're coming from or where they're maybe getting these opinions. So keeping that in mind, doing what you can to resolve the issue, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But I do want to point out, again, this started as a training. If someone's being aggressive, get someone else involved. If you're uncomfortable, get someone else involved. It is, even if you're at a higher level where you don't have a supervisor to bring in, still bringing in a second person can be really helpful so you don't end up in any he said, she said situations. Getting an extra party involved can always be a good thing. So what are some of the resolutions that I find work really well? There's some reading the audience, and for anyone who's an educator, you know, not the same direction is going to work for every person or every topic, but giving information about the exhibit, giving species specific traits, contextualizing what they're talking about with examples from the wild, personifying, or empathy and perspective taking, to me are all really great ways to diffuse some of these negative zoo comments. So to put that into context, one that anyone who's had tigers, a lot of different species, have probably heard, it's the quintessential, the tiger must be so bored, she's pacing so much. You overhear that and you go, oh, I don't like that they think that they care about the tiger. How do I get them to understand that this is actually a well cared for tiger? You can use all of these different ways to explain that. So exhibit information, talking about enrichment, right? This is one that we go to a lot. Oh, they look so hot. They actually have access to a place with shade. One of the issues we used to have is all of our water features in the 90s when they were trying to make everything look naturalistic, they hit all the lixids. So now guests think all of our animals don't have water and are dehydrated all summer. And just a simple saying, actually, do you see that weird pipe over there? That's water. So giving information about the exhibit, it can be that simple. Species specific natural behaviors. So I would quite often address this comment. This is one of my favorites, was saying, well, she is pacing. That's what tigers do in the wild. Tigers are independent and they actually spend the majority of their day pacing their area, pacing their territory. If my tiger is walking in circles, I'm not worried. Now, if an orangutan is walking in circles around their exhibit, that is probably a stereotypic behavior because they tend to wander. They don't have defined territories. So explaining zookeepers know their animals, know what's normal for that animal or what's not normal for that animal. And this is normal. It's not a sign of boredom, can be helpful. You can also contextualize, that one was kind of a wild example with more specific wild examples, like their habitats in the wild. There is a study, and I can definitely find it and send it out. I probably should have found it in advance. In areas with greater prey abundance, tiger habitats tend to be smaller. So what that says is that tigers want a habitat that is a size that is enough to get enough food, no bigger, which makes a lot of sense when you think about energy budgets and things like that, right? They don't want to patrol a huge area if they don't have to. Because in a zoo, we are giving them all the food that they need. They don't need a bigger territory. As long as they have enough to exhibit their natural behaviors, play, patrol, they are good to go. Personification, talking about this tiger had a great morning and now she's taking a nap. She's an old lady. She deserves to have her nap time, right? She is, a baby and he was playing all morning, or whatever it is, just explaining whatever your animal's personality is. We had a very senior tiger at my last facility, and that was often what I would say is, yeah, if I'm 90, I'm taking naps all day too. She gets up, she was just up, 2 hours ago, playing with her, chewing on her bone today. It's bone day today. And right now she's just relaxing and taking a nap. And then the last one, empathy and perspective taking, in this example would look, I would say, the grocery store example. So yes, she is sitting. Humans could also potentially hunt for their food, but when I get all my food from the grocery store, and that's what I'm used to day in, day out, I'm much happier sitting on my couch than chasing a chicken down the street. And so that always gets a chuckle from someone if you have someone more lighthearted, and then they go, oh yeah, okay, I get it. Maybe she's not bored. That's why she's napping. That's why she's pacing, things like that. She's just relaxed. So hopefully that makes some sense. Words is another thing I want everyone to kind of keep in mind. And I know the Empathy Network has a great resource of words to avoid. And a lot of times we avoid that to avoid some of those negative connotations, but also thinking about buzzwords. Again, from the Frameworks Institute, this actually came from climate change. But if you think about climate change, what did it used to be called? It's global warming. And that changed to climate change. Why? Now, global warming is a little misleading, but it also had a lot of quote unquote brand recognition if you think about it. So it wasn't just to make it more accurate that it changed. It changed because there was so much anti-global warming in the 90s out there, put out by entities. We don't need to get political here, but it became such a politically charged buzzword that when people hear that term, their brain would immediately snap into preconceived notions. When you hear words that you've already heard and made an opinion about, you're less open to thinking of new ideas related to that term. That's why they changed it to climate change. And actually now, best practices for teaching climate change, some of you might know, Noki says this, Climate Gen in Minnesota says this, you don't actually use the term climate change at all. You just talk about the science and the facts, because when you bring up those words, it triggers those preconceived notions. The same can go for zoo negativity. It was so hard for me to avoid saying the word captivity for a very long time because it's a scientific term and it just means the animals in human care. That's what it means. Why can't we say? Because the second you say captivity, people snap back into some of those preconceived notions. When you talk about cage, they can snap back into those preconceived notions. So keeping in mind, all of those words that we avoid in language, and I'm not perfect about it, saying animals that live in the zoo instead of collection animals, all of that great empathy language also can feed into building more positive associations when you're dealing with someone who maybe doesn't love zoos as much. So all of these work well for specific complaints when you have someone coming up to you saying XYZ about this animal, or the dreaded email with 6 of them that someone sends in after a day at the zoo. But what about just a general hatred of zoos? I have a few talking points that I would use in training for new staff, especially interns, volunteers, and teens who might come in with wildly different knowledge bases than someone who comes in with a zoology degree and or internships under their belt. And I really think these are good things to think about and kind of list out and contextualize some of the ways to talk about why zoos are important. So again, you can tell I have an education background, so I love when you guys give me answers in the chat or unmute. Why do zoos matter at their core? Not a rhetorical question, but why do they matter? You got some thinking, hopefully. Connecting people to green spaces, wildlife, wild places. connections, access, connections. Maybe provide a home to animals that can't live in the wild. Conservation initiatives. Yep. Lots and lots of connections. See an animal you might not otherwise get a chance to see. Teaching, education, different styles. Ensuring genetic diversity and survival of species. Yes. Absolutely. Inspiring action. Yes, I was hoping someone would say that. Conservation funds. I know I have a zoo audience here because I think we hit everything on my list. But a lot of people don't think about some of these things when they think about zoos, right? Zoo professionals, we live and breathe this day in, day out. So these come to us pretty easily. But it is amazing how many volunteers never thought about anything outside of connection. So talking about breeding programs, what is an SSP? What is the population management center? You know, how are zoos impacting those wild populations? I always like to ask, name an animal that would likely be extinct if not for zoo intervention. And I'm sure all of you can think of one or two that your institution likes to talk about all the time. So everything from the whooping crane, black-footed ferrets, Arabian oryx, there's so many examples. You guys know this, right? I also like to talk about things like African penguins when I talk about breeding programs and conservation and the nest building project. I always ask, you know, okay, the guano issue, they nest in guano's being harvested, growing populations, they need food too, understandable. So who knows how to build a perfect nest box to maximize reproductive success of African penguins? No one did. So they actually piloted that project in zoos, and fun fact, zoos paid to put a bunch of nest boxes out there with Sandco. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that story, but stories like that, I know there's many other examples that I'm sure you guys can come up with, really make people understand how important zoos are, because in the wild, you can't really use birds that are already struggling to get enough calcium to lay eggs to test these nests. Now they did later, but those first drafts doing it in zoos, that's huge. That's a benefit of zoos that people don't think about. The research that people do in zoos, both being able to tie, you know, fecal samples to blood and endocrine samples so that you can do more impactful, non-invasive research in the wild. Research on breeding in zoos. Breeding is obviously really important for species survival. I always like to give the example of white-naped cranes, who they could not figure out what conditions would make them breed, why they weren't breeding in certain places or certain years in the wild, why they weren't breeding in zoos. And someone made the connection that they had more breeding success with sprinklers on. So they actually did a study and figured out that if you put sprinklers in with white-naped cranes, suddenly they start laying fertilized eggs, because they lay eggs when the rains come. Suddenly, not only did they know how to better propagate this species in zoos, they also had a better idea of what habitats in the wild to protect. Marine mammals are another great example of this, because they are so tricky to study in the wild and we don't know so much about their habits. What we learn from research done in zoos can then connect to that field research. So those are all things that a lot of people don't even think about beyond the actual research, where, you know, there's safe programs and zoos that have researchers working out in the field. Connecting people to nature. You guys all know this. It's more impactful to see an animal than see a picture in a book. I'm not going to harp on that one. I think everyone here is an expert at that. Similarly, education, and I do consider these two different things, because the connection to me is the empathy and the emotional and the inspiration, but then the education that we do, talking about all of the school programs, curriculum-based work, how people will retain more information. There was a study I read where people will retain more information about history if there's a cheetah in the room versus not. And just small things like that, it gets people's attention. It's memorable. Again, most of you guys are experts on this. Conservation funding work and expertise. I always love to point out how much money comes from zoos. You know, this is one of those places where you say more people visit AZA institutions every year than all professional sporting events combined. When AZA put that out in Why Zoos and Aquariums Matter, I think 3. We all love that fact. We all say that fact. That also means that there is money coming in, and while zoos are expensive, zoos also are committed to field research, conservation funding, and the majority of field funding does come from zoos. And work and expertise. This is another one that people don't think about a lot. Yes, and specifically why zoos and aquariums matter. 3, I can definitely find. Someone just asked in the chat, sorry, if we could share some of these studies. I will definitely try to look for some of these and send them out after this. But the work and expertise for conservation funding is something a lot of volunteers, interns, teens coming in don't think about. Things like the Australian brush fires, and everyone in the world wanted to go volunteer who had the money to do so. But they said, we really only want people with marsupial burn experience. Who has that? Zoos. Talking about the orangutan rehabilitation center in Borneo, where a lot of the staffing comes from AZA zoos and SAFE sending keepers out in rotation. Talking about oil spills and sand cob pulling volunteers in from New England Aquarium and other aquariums across the country who had the experience tube feeding penguins who could help in that. So all of these are reasons zoos matter that you may not think about when you're having these conversations. And all of these are different talking points you can bring up that are really important. But that's great. But your anti-zoo person might say, okay, so zoos are doing some good, but none of that matters if the animals in your care are suffering. I agree. And that's then when you can go into some of those more general things that people might not think about when it comes to individual animal care. And again, I'm not going to dive into these deep with you guys, but just going through concepts like AZA standards and enrichment, but also choice. Choice is a big one that a lot of people don't talk about that really changes people's perspectives when you talk about voluntary blood draws, and again, empathy and having people picture, what does it feel like when you go to the doctor to get a shot? What is it like when you bring your dog to the vet? And a lot of people go, oh, yeah, it's pretty bad. Now imagine, how would you do that for a rhino? And you get oh boy. Nope, you just say, step up, poke, good girl. That's all there is to it, because there's a relationship built between keepers and animals, them having the choice of where to go, the movement with ambassador animals for everything to be voluntary. All of these things also can be really great talking points. And again, you all know how to talk about these things, but they really can change perspectives because they're things we take for granted. A lot of keepers in particular don't think about people not knowing that the animals have choice. And when you get people who have that mindset that the animals are quote unquote imprisoned, or, the captive thought, knowing that those animals have choice and backing it up, again, some of the studies by Temple Grandin and some of the work by Temple Grandin while it was on livestock, it's a really good scientific basis for this. So you can play to the scientific, you can play to the emotional. There's many different directions that you can go when explaining that also the individual animals have quality care. So I did great on time. Amazing. I want to hear from some of you guys. So again, education background. I don't like just talking at a screen. So if you're not comfortable raising your hand, you can pop it into the chat, or you can raise your hand and Emily or I might pass it to Emily. So only one of us is trying to pull people up and call on them. But feel free to put your little hand raise emoji up. What have you heard and just had no idea what to say to that? And do you have a technique that works really well for you, or something that I did that said that didn't work really well for you? Any of that kind of stuff to share. I know we mentioned we would love for people to come with thoughts, ideas, questions. Feel free to pop those in the chat or raise hands and share out. And if other people have answers too, I would love to hear those. The awkward moment while people gather their thoughts.
Not a hand raise, but we do have one clapping emoji happening that I'm seeing.
If you ever had that comment that just makes you go, oh boy, what do I even say to that? Good chance to kind of brainstorm. Oh, we got one in the chat. All right. Oh, and we got a raised hand. I'll do the one in the chat and then we'll move to Brian, I think. So I've had people who insist zoos shouldn't exist and animals should go to a sanctuary instead. How do I convince them that it's essentially the same thing, even if they insist sanctuaries are different or better? That is a really good one, a common one that I'm sure a lot of us have heard, or trying to push animals to move to sanctuaries. One of the things that I will encourage, especially if you have someone who's really passionate and wants to do research, is explaining USDA requirements versus accreditation requirements for zoos and aquariums. I never want to say that if you're not AZA, you're bad, but there are really good standards for AZA zoos and just generally standards that are above USDA. So when you're looking at a sanctuary, explaining they only have to meet a bar that's maybe this high, and you could be meeting a bar that is this high or this high for the animals, and that every place is different. Talking about how zoos have ways to make sure that the public don't have as huge of a negative impact on welfare, talking about all of the animal welfare or animal well-being work that AZA zoos are doing can be huge. And just asking them sometimes if they don't want to go down the science road, or they're talking over you, you can't get into that more detailed thing. Just saying, hey, in your brain, what is the difference between a sanctuary and a zoo? Because in my brain, they're essentially the same thing. And it's just each individual one that's different. But what do you think? And that might also help you kind of hone in on what that might be, what that difference might be.
Awesome. Brian, did you want to ask your question?
All right. Maybe we circle back to Brian and go. I think there's another hand raise.
Yeah, Kamoya, go ahead.
Can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. I do programming in my day-to-day job, and so that just means I talk to a lot of different people. And one of the techniques that I think really works is just validating people's criticism of the zoo, because zoos have a long history and it's kind of muddled with not so great things. And what's nice is that we've been evolving, and maybe those folks don't necessarily know what ways that we've evolved. And so like one of the things that I just do is like, great, you should be critical of institutions that have live animals, and most zoos are like staples in communities, so that's another reason to be critical of the institution. And so I feel like when I immediately do that, people automatically like put down their like super defensive guard, because I think they expect me to go, wait, no, but zoos are this and this and this. But I think acknowledging that zoos are consistently evolving and adapting to be better is, I think, really helpful to like kind of break down those barriers for people who might just think a lot about like what zoos were like in the 60s, you know, like something like that. So that's a technique that I tend to use when folks come to me, just, yeah, a little bit frustrated about zoos.
Yeah, Kamoya, thank you so much for sharing that. And that hits on a really good point that I didn't cover, which is, I talk about listening, but I didn't say, you might not be the one who's right. There are valid arguments. Zoos are changing and evolving, and not just like you were talking about, which is a great point, from the 60s to today. But even in the last few years, if you look at the changes that have been made in elephant and chimpanzee regulations, where we are moving them to larger spaces with more social groups because we learned that improves their welfare, right? So listening and hearing them out, and also being humble enough to know we don't know everything either, and we are constantly reevaluating and figuring out how to do best for our animals. One example, I once had someone tell me, oh, I can't see the zebras, it's so overgrown up there. I'm like, well, we keep some stuff a little overgrown to make sure that, they feel comfortable. And, but I'll go, they're like, I couldn't see them at all. So I'll go take a look. I went up there, and yeah, we had some training issues and a recent baby zebra, and things were chaotic, and the keeper had let the brush go. We didn't have a horticulture team. And I went, oh, you were right. We will go cut a couple more windows up there. Thank you so much for letting me know. So those points. And I think that kind of ties in really well to a great question Joanne put in the chat too, about how do you address situations where the zoo is making changes because it's a poor situation for the species, so phasing a species out because there isn't adequate space, like sometimes chimpanzees, elephants, habitat options, progress is good, but it may not mean it's an ideal solution. Jaren, that is also a really good point, and one that I like to address. A lot of times you just have to be honest. and, say, yes, this animal, has all their welfare needs met. They have this great diet. They have all these things, but you're right. We are wrong on that one. This elephant should be in a bigger space with other elephants. And we are working towards him moving in 2 years. We are a nonprofit working to do what we can for the animals, and that will be happening blank. And just being honest and explaining, because they know that we are people too, and they know that things aren't perfect. And if we constantly just puff out our chests and pretend that everything is always perfect and hunky-dory in the zoo world, which it is not, we know this, we lose that authenticity, and we're going to lose that trust with the public if we can't admit where our faults are and where we're trying to improve, or say, that's a really great point. So I think in those situations, honesty is really good. And I think that's something that's been happening a lot more with the new generation who are coming into the zoo field post, Blackfish, and some of that is we are a lot more transparent in what we're doing. And I think that is huge. All right, maybe we go back to another hand raise and another chat question.
Yeah, we have a chat question that kind of ties to that honesty one, from Kira. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. It says, we have a decent amount of guests who are frustrated by animal choice and feel like, what's the point of seeing a zoo if they can't be seen, they being the animals. I struggle with answering that well.
Yeah, and that is that's probably the biggest complaint that zoos get. And for that, I mean, there's only so much you can say to that particular one other than explaining that they have choice and just saying, we're doing our best because we put our animals first. You are coming here, I know, to have a good time, but you are also supporting a conservation organization, and we really appreciate your support. Also, did you see, and you can kind of redirect, and that's more of an educator hat. What else is interesting that they might be able to see? What is an interesting fact? Is there a time that that animal might be more active? Are there ways that you can resolve it with some of those customer service education-y things? But I mean, that's a hard one, and it's a good problem to have because we know that the animals are getting those choices now, and we're not locking animals on exhibit or restricting exhibits just for guest entertainment anymore. And then sometimes that history angle on that one can be good too, and that we aren't just for entertainment anymore. Welfare comes first.
Angelica, looks like you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. So basically, just sorry, my radio is on. Zoo problems. Basically, this chat has also gotten me thinking about people that I know that are, again, genuinely good people, just misplaced empathy, or they are fans of PETA, or they get their information about these zoos from these organizations. And the general thing that I've heard is that these orgs tend to somehow speak louder than zoos in terms of what's really going on in zoos, or in AZA zoos at least. And do you feel like that's true? And if so, would you think that there's some ways we need to brainstorm to speak louder, or do you think it's, yeah?
It's a really good point. So louder is an interesting word, and this is my personal opinion. I should have done it this time. I didn't like to preface that I have a bias because I want to work in zoos since I was 3. So I like zoos. I've worked in zoos for 15 years. But louder is a weird term in today's world, in my personal opinion, with social media and algorithms the way they are. I feel like if you already have people in your circles or a predisposition to thinking in PETA's direction or in an animal rights direction, you're going to see more animal rights content. You're going to hear it more from your peer group, from those internet sources. And if you have more of an animal welfare perspective and you're, into zoos, or that's more in your circle, that's probably what's going to be louder. And that question is a massive societal question that we don't, I think, have time to fully address today. I do think zoos are doing a lot better job of trying to be louder. I mean, working at Lincoln Park Zoo, louder and prouder is our current PR strategy internally. This really started with the zoo on Animal Planet that Bronx Zoo put out. And I think that was a fantastic start. More zoos are showing behind the scenes videos, training demonstrations. That was my first big empathy project, was public training demonstrations at the zoo I was working at, because I feel like that is the strategy to exactly what you're saying, being louder. We have this great work that's being done that's interesting, that's engaging. And so letting people see behind the scenes instead of what it was when I started in zoos, which was no one ever sees behind the scenes. No one ever gets to know what goes on back there. We keep it quiet because they might twist it and put it the wrong way. And then just tell people, stop hiding it, because when we're hiding it, we look fishy and people think we are fishy. So to me, I think that's the biggest strategy to trying to drown out some of the other things. But the other piece is just what we're doing as educators, building scientific literacy. I don't want anyone to listen to my talk and just think zoos are great now, any more than I want them to listen to a PETA talk and think zoos are horrible. The more people who are thinking critically and doing their own research, the less that problem is going to be. So keep educating. All right.
All right. Next question from the chat, from Katie. What do you say if somebody gives an example, and you don't know if it's true or not? Here's a made up example. Quote, at such and such AZA zoo, I heard that the primates are not given any enrichment at all. My friend is a volunteer there.
So with these, sometimes the first thing I'll always say, and this is if it's that, or I heard hippos have no teeth, any of those weird stuff, saying, never just going out with a no, because again, then you're being the polarizing voice of just shutting everything down, saying, that's interesting. I have never heard that. And in that specific example, I might then give some evidence why it would be unlikely. Like, that would be really crazy to me because AZA requires enrichment, and actually USDA requires enrichment for some animals like primates. So I would imagine that they would probably not just lose their accreditation, but get shut down for something like that. That's really interesting. There's regular inspections and things like that. So I'd be surprised if that were true, but definitely something that I will read up on and learn more about, because then you're not putting them down. You're not saying you're wrong, but you're still giving them reasons that they're probably wrong, right? Because they have firsthand experience or thoughts in their head, and you're not going to be able to just say no. That's not going to be functional. But giving them reasons why that would be shocking, that can then tie into some of those talking points, is usually how I like to personally handle that. And I'm answering all these questions, but if other people have other answers, there's a lot of talented educators in this room. So feel free to pop in chat or raise your hand if you have an alternative strategy to some of these too.
Yeah, definitely. There's been a lot of good questions in the chat and a lot of good answers, both from folks in the chat and from you, Aszya. And so what I'm planning on doing after this is going back through the recording and like writing these things down, and people can reference those afterwards as well. So yeah, this information will not be lost. Rin, I see that your hand is up.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
At our zoo, we have a few animal species that are solitary animals. And I get a lot of questions from people who struggle seeing animals maybe like by themselves or alone in an exhibit, and they don't necessarily respond well to the answer that, well, this animal just likes to be alone. Is there any like further information or better ways to communicate that?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. And sometimes too, it depends on why is that animal alone, because there's usually one of two reasons. One of them could be you're waiting on a wreck and someone passed away, which is an easy one. I think most people accept that as an answer. It's usually either that species is solitary or that individual prefers to be solitary. So those can be a little bit different. If it is the individual, there's probably a reason your institution knows that, and that's pretty easy. You can give that example. Again, transparency. Now, I know some people might have a reason that your institution is not willing to share with the public, and that can be a trickier situation. But if there's any way you can talk around it or allude to it without violating institutional policy. But I think what you're probably getting at, Rin, is more the species specific being solitary. So something like a tiger, great example. If just saying, they prefer being alone doesn't work, talking about, you never find these living in a group, moms will live with their offspring for a few years and then they tend to go off, can be a good one. Or even, sometimes you get that you got to go to their level and kind of be a little less professional. I've got, the big gruff guy or someone who's joking with me and seems jovial, but not about it, saying like, yeah, if I put another tiger in there, they'd probably kill each other. What? and then they're like interested in interacting with you, and it's a little less professional, but it's a true fact, right? And explaining that, talking about it from that direction can be another strategy. It's a tricky one, but those are some things that have worked for me.
All right, going back down through that chat. Question from Jesse, which I think is an interesting one. When it comes to giving examples of animal care and well-being, do you ever use comparisons to domestic animals or pets to help people understand? Or do you try to draw clear distinctions between wild animals and domestics? And since a bunch of us in this org all come from different size zoos, demographics of visitors to our zoos, I think, Asia, if you have an answer to this question, and then if other folks have ways that they do it as well, because I'm imagining it's going to differ from org to org, definitely feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat as well.
Yeah, for me on this one, yes and no. It depends. And again, some of it comes from reading the audience. If it's someone who's like, oh, he's so cute, I want one, I'm not going to probably use domestic animals with that person, but they're also probably not going to be the one who are anti-zoo. When I'm talking about anti-zoo, for me personally, I will use comparisons to domestic animals, because that's something relatable to people in a lot of cases. Now, obviously, then there's the general captive and people who think you shouldn't even have pets because of animal rights. And in that situation, you can use domestic animal things. You're probably not going to get very far on that extreme opinion. But things like I was even using a domestic example earlier with voluntary blood draws and how animals have choice, and how the animals at the zoo have fantastic vet care. Your pet sees a vet once a year, and that is a great pet owner. Buy the book, you're doing amazing. Ours see the vet at minimum once a year, and they're seen by an experienced tech who's basically a vet tech. Keepers are pretty close every single day, comparing the diets to the diets of yourself or your pets at home. So I do use those in these cases. If someone's anti-zoo, they're probably not someone who's going to get a pet chimpanzee at home. So a little bit of reading the audience for me on that one, but I'd be interested. I know we have a lot of questions also, but I'd be interested to hear if other people have thoughts on that one, like Emily said. While we're waiting, I'll just address Trinity's comment, adding to animal choice, also talking about keepers working to find preference studies, supporting animal well-being. I'll even tie into that, the welfare assessments that animals have yearly is a great talking point. So it's a really good point on that one, Trinity. Anyone come up with other thoughts on domestics before we move on to the next question? Oh, Emily, you're muted.
Dang it. Okay, Kira, I found comparing and contrasting domestic pets versus farm animals versus zoo animals is really helpful. The farm in comparison really drive things home. Awesome.
Really good point.
All right.
And also enrichment, because we have an enrichment program, and I think I talk a lot about just domestic pets and what the types of enrichment that people give to their own pets, and just kind of relate that to what our keepers do for our animals. That's a very popular link that I do consistently.
Yeah, and even training, dog training versus training zoo animals, positive reinforcement. A lot of those talking points we all have in our back pockets for sure. Thanks, Kamaya.
All right, we have another question in the chat from Moira. How do you respond to criticism that AZA is made up of, quote, industry insiders, and thus accreditation isn't as meaningful? It's a big question.
That is a really good question. I've actually never gotten that one before, because I feel like in general, the public who's anti-zoo don't tend to be that knowledgeable about AZA, but you could definitely get the disgruntled, ex-zookeeper and things like that there too. Without getting overly zoo political, there is a lot of politics in the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. There's also a lot of politics in the US government, but we still need laws. That's kind of one of the ways that I think about it. There is possibility that there are industry insiders, and there is possibility that it isn't as meaningful, but I do think that as is important. I think talking about the fact that there are teams of experts, there's not one person who's making these decisions, some of the transparency to what goes on with AZA. And then also just broadening it to, you could talk all day about AZA and if it's good or bad. I personally believe that it is overall good, but has its issues like any large organization does. But you don't necessarily have to focus on AZA as the only standard or the only talking point. And frankly, there are fantastic zoos and aquariums that are not part of AZA that are still doing an absolutely fantastic job for their animals. Whenever I talk about AZA in an onboarding, I always say, I've only worked in AZA, I've volunteered at other fantastic places. AZA is not an end all be all. You still have to do your own research on an institution if you want to learn more about it, because not every place is the same. AZA is a stamp that might make you feel that they're better, but you still have to look into it yourself because every place is different. And then you can also point out that places lose accreditation. It happens frequently. And a lot of them have people that are, have held high up positions within the AZA board and things like that. So it is not just a rubber stamp. There definitely are processes and people do lose accreditation for welfare concerns.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question is from Lindsay. In your opinion, how does one best address questions and concerns about animal escapes, like bird fly-offs? This is especially hard because those situations don't always end well.
Yeah, that is a good question. I would, again, definitely invite anyone who has good thoughts or spins on that one, because even I'm sitting here thinking a little bit. I mean, I think some of it is just things happen and it's unfortunate and it's horrible. Things happen in the wild and it's unfortunate and it's horrible. And we do our best and we're not perfect. I think that's kind of the big one there. When it's a sad situation, when it's recent, when it's close to people's hearts, I don't think I would go this direction. But if someone's just asking kind of a more general question, you can also talk about stories where animals have quote unquote escaped and were found in a tree 2 feet from their enclosure, or breaches of enclosure where the animal didn't even bother to leave because they're so content and they see it as their territory. So some of those counter examples, and like it happens because an animal gets spooked, a lot of times, specifically thinking of a bird fly off on a flight show, a lot of times it's because a raptor flew overhead and they panicked, not because they hate their life, right? But if it is, again, more recent, more emotionally sensitive, just being sensitive to that and like, yeah, I had to think a lot about that too, but these things happen and he still had a fantastic life. And in the wild, he could have been prey. And this is just sometimes what happens. And not trying to say, well, we're better. We're like, especially if it's a mistake, like we're human, we made a mistake. We messed this one up. And just being honest and open again is a really good strategy for a lot of these. Hopefully we all believe what we're doing. And in a lot of these really tricky cases, just being honest can be the best policy.
There is a response in the chat to this question too, from Ryan. Says, I like to compare animal escapes to my cats trying to slip out of the front door when it opens. Their home is my apartment. They aren't intending to escape their home and leave forever. They're just curious and don't know the danger that lies outside their home.
Yeah.
That's a good
great
example.
empathy approach to that one too. I like it.
Yeah, as an owner of a cat who frequently tries to go exploring, yeah, I think that's a good answer.
My cats have double containment for that reason, just like in a zoo.
Awesome. We do have about 10 minutes left. So there's, Amoya says, and highlighting the importance of safety that the zoo has for the community. Yeah, we don't want semi-dangerous animals walking around to hurt someone. Yeah. Thanks for adding that, Kamoya. Give it a little thumbs up. Awesome. We do have about 10 minutes left. So we have a couple of, time for a couple extra questions if anybody has them.
Yeah, and as negative and hard as these conversations are, I always like to point out too, remember why we're here. We're here for them. We're making their lives better. And even if people can be negative about our work, just go look at a rhino and you'll feel better. Don't worry. Any other questions? Questions for me? Questions in general? Questions for everyone? Have you ever seen this kind of stuff? If not, and this is also to fill space, so don't feel like you can't put in a question while I'm talking. I do just want to thank everyone, not just for coming, but also for sharing thoughts and your questions and your answers in particular. I know, especially with Zoom, it's hard to speak up and speak your mind, especially on such a sensitive and difficult topic. So I really, really appreciate how many of you guys jumped in and shared thoughts, shared comments, things like that. And made this a really great interactive conversation rather than me just talking at you all, because I do not know everything. Nobody knows everything. I am far, far from it. So I really, really appreciate that.
And I am not seeing anything come through the chat. Oh, I said that, and the question popped in. Stunning. All right, this is from Catherine. How do you respond to conversations about birth control or using dummy eggs for birds? It's important, but a lot of people don't love the idea of us taking eggs or preventing birth.
Yeah, and that's a really good question that can even extend to other birth control forms in zoos and aquariums. Honestly, less so aquariums unless they're mammals and birds. An empathy approach can work, and just kind of saying we don't have space and it's a humane way to keep things together. But dummy eggs, I think, is a great answer to taking the eggs and explaining like they want to go through and have this nest. So we put the dummy eggs in, explaining reclutching, explaining some of the calcium deficiencies. I think for that one, it's just a lot of, again, that honesty. And there's so many different situations, right? We don't have space. This is overrepresented. There's a genetic issue. Whatever the reason may be, this male constantly pushes the eggs out of the nest and they crack anyway. So we took them to incubate them. Whatever the situation is, because there's a trillion different reasons with birds in particular, really any animals that we do that birth control can really help. So just again, that honesty approach for those, whatever the circumstances.
I am not a bird person. I don't know if anybody else in this audience is also like me and not a bird person. Can you explain what reclutching is? I don't think I've heard that before.
Yeah, so it's really common in a lot of species of birds. If something happens to their eggs, so a human comes in and takes them, or a predator comes in and takes them, they'll lay more eggs, right? If it's still early enough in the season, they do that. If things keep happening to their eggs and they keep laying more eggs in like a zoo situation, the female will start to get calcium deficiency issues from the egg shell and having to create that, other nutritional deficiencies. And the more eggs laid, the higher chance of egg bound birds where the egg kind of gets stuck and it's a veterinary medical emergency. So they just kind of will relay eggs.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Thank you. I did not know that. All right, I think this may be our last question. This is from Rin. We recently had a muskox calf born, and many people will have started asking the question, will the baby stay here with the parents forever? How do you approach knowing there's a chance that a baby may move for SSP or for breeding? I've heard frustrations from guests surrounding animals moving.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one that I think all of us have probably seen before. This isn't possible for everyone, but for me in my previous role, I was in charge of our PR as well as everything else about the animals. So pushing for those initial press releases to talk about SSPs, and even if they don't want to say that it's leaving or not yet, saying that this is part of an SSP where animals are moved around the country and what that is, and trying to prep guests for that from the beginning can be really helpful in kind of starting that conversation and prepping, because I think a lot of it comes from the shock, especially for your members and volunteers who feel a sense of connection to the offspring watching them grow up. Some species, I don't know a lot about muskox, but for some species you can also talk about natural dispersal, and that wild type approach, or even just saying like, well, it's time for him to grow up and go have his own family. He has to leave the nest. He's going to move on to a bachelor herd. We all have that age. We love our babies, but when they go up, so there's different empathy approaches too, depending on the species. But because it can be such a shock with those, just kind of trying to prep people as early in the baby's life as possible so that they know their baby might have to go away someday can help.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Aszya, for leading this conversation and facilitating the discussion. This was one of our biggest non-summit or network meeting learning groups in terms of attendance. So thank you all for coming and contributing to this conversation. And I definitely don't think it's a conversation that's going to close when this meeting ends. And so we could definitely continue this in other spaces. And like we said, this is being recorded, so the recording of this event will go up. We can gather those resources that Aszya mentioned and talked about, as well as share the kind of FAQ document that we'll make, and we'll share all of those in conjunction with this recording being posted on the website, so you can reference anything that we talked about today after the meeting. And I saw that, Aszya, you just dropped your email in the chat there. Do you want to go ahead and talk about
Yeah,
that?
just if you have questions, feel free to reach out, or if there was a specific resource I mentioned, because I read a lot of papers for fun because I'm that kind of nerd, so I might not remember everything I referenced. And if there's one you're like, oh, I want that for a grant or something like that, feel free to shoot me an email and I'll see if I can't dig it up.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you guys all for attending today, and being a part of this conversation. And you're getting some thank yous pouring in the chat. So great job, Aszya. Round of applause. Awesome. All right.
Thank you all.
All right, everybody. We will talk to you later. Have a wonderful rest of your day, wonderful rest of your week. And thank you for coming for our first fall learning group. Bye, all.
Thanks, everyone.